Now, for more on Tencent's music's IPO and China's music industry, I'm joined live from New York by Cherie Hu. She's a music business journalist and researcher. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Tencent Music's IPO. It would make it one of the largest traditional IPOs by market value in the US since Alibaba in 2014. Just how significant is this move for Tencent?
I think it's quite significant for a lot of different reasons, especially thinking on an international scale. For sure, everyone in the United States is looking at this IPO with a lot of scrutiny, given that it is set to debut in the States, and given that we had just heard about Spotify's shares not doing so well, and investors and people in the music industry realizing that the music streaming business is actually really difficult and it's not really easy to turn a profit, whereas Tencent Music, given its whole suite of apps, given the fact that it's made over 70% of its money from in-app tipping and not actually from anything subscription-related, it's providing a really different model, and a lot of people all over the world are realizing that this could be a viable investment opportunity beyond the dominant model that more Western services like Spotify have put to the table.
Now, it's interesting because Tencent and Spotify have equity stakes in each other's companies. Talk about some of these, either these partnerships or collaborations, and what role they're playing in Tencent growing.
Yes. Spotify and Tencent each own around like a 10 to 12% stake in each other, and it was when they did that equity swap, it was a pretty landmark partnership. There really was nothing like it before, and I would like to think it mutually benefits both parties because Spotify has yet to launch in China. It has yet to launch in India and a lot of other countries that contain a huge proportion of the world's population. And so a stake in a company as big as Tencent is really good, both just financially for them generally and also just to get a better sense of how consumers are listening to music and consuming the types of media in those markets before they officially launch. And then the other way around, there's a huge benefit too, given that Spotify is still growing pretty quickly in the United States, despite the fact that the market, some people do have a perception that the market is really saturated, given how many players there are, but it is still growing pretty impressively in the US and also in Europe. And Tencent, given the fact that it has dominated so much of the Chinese market, but really has not looked beyond, I think that's a really good first smart move.
And speaking of Tencent's domination, to what degree would you say it's helping and perhaps even in some cases hurting the growth of China's music industry?
That's a really interesting question. I think from the perspective of music streaming platforms, Tencent Music owns a lot of them, but it's certainly not the only one. There's another one called NetEase Cloud Music that some people have compared to SoundCloud, but in China and in Asian markets. And I know both local and international artists are increasingly using NetEase to market to their fans in that country. And that's growing really, really quickly. There is something to say about Tencent owning an entire ecosystem, though, for marketing music. The closest thing that you could compare in the States would be like Amazon having an Amazon Music service, but then also dominating the smart speaker market and sort of dominating that whole ecosystem, or Apple having one of the fastest growing music streaming businesses by subscriber count, but that also partially being because they have this whole entire ecosystem of devices like, cloud services, et cetera. And so I think Tencent is a little bit analogous. And in the Chinese market, generally, that is the standard model for music streaming ownership. Whereas like in the West, you still have companies like Spotify, which is the global market leader by paid subscriptions. That is what people call a pure play music company. So they don't have any other tech-related interests necessarily.
Right.
Whereas in China, you really don't have any of those types of services. Like all the music services sit under these big tech conglomerates that have a lot of other verticals. So I think it won't completely be a monopoly in that there are a lot of other streaming platforms coming up, but there is something to be said about music not really being the core businesses of these companies at the end of the day.
And Cherie, what about artists themselves? When they look at Tencent versus other ways to get their music out there, what sort of role is technology playing in boosting their popularity?
That's a really good question. And it's an especially contentious one, I think, from the perspective of record labels in the US and in Western markets, because the copyright and licensing situation in China historically wasn't that good, such that labels wouldn't even think twice about launching in China just because they knew they wouldn't really get any revenue from streaming services or from other types of music sales. But increasingly they're realizing, one, not only is the copyright picture becoming a lot better, but the media ecosystem and music ecosystem there is just inherently a lot more social. Like you do have Chinese companies owning apps like TikTok now. That's not under Tencent, but I think TikTok and other sort of live streaming, looping video apps, and the fact that a lot of celebrities are now jumping onto that, and the fact that that's become an international phenomenon, that type of capability is not something that anything like Spotify or Apple Music or Pandora or Amazon Music can provide. So I think that's definitely one area where Chinese and Asian apps and companies generally are ahead in terms of providing that social experience. And so I think, like for artists looking at Tencent, they see companies like that as they see that as a big advantage for sure.
All right, thank you so much for your insights. We'll have to leave it there. Cherrie Hu there, music business journalist and researcher.